In the velvet shadows of palaces and portraits, beneath crowns and corsets, lived 25 royal women whose appetites defied the throne they served. History called them scandalous. The court called them dangerous, but behind the whispers were lives lived out loud, messy, magnetic, and maddeningly unrepentant. This isn't the history you were taught, it's the one they tried to burn. Welcome to the untamed legacy of the 25 worst nymphas of British royalty, where power wore perfume and pleasure was a political weapon. Before we dive in, if twisted royal history, dark secrets, and scandal-soaked bedtime tales are your thing, make sure you're subscribed. We've got a whole archive of chaos waiting. And while you're here, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you listen to this royal descent into madness? Drop it in the comments. We're watching with you. 1. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, 1768 to 1821. To understand Queen Caroline of Brunswick is to understand the full, unfiltered absurdity of royal dysfunction. A woman whose entire existence became a battleground for public morality, private scandal, and imperial hypocrisy. She was not merely a royal wife, she was a walking tabloid headline in an era before tabloids even existed. And if there was one thing she knew how to do better than royal duty, it was defy it. Caroline was born into privilege, yes, the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick and Princess Augusta of Great Britain, but she never quite fit the mould. Even as a child, she was described as irreverent, brash, and occasionally too frank for her own good. Her hygiene habits were questionable, her humour was bawdy, and her sense of decorum was non-existent, which of course made her a perfect match for George IV. A man so allergic to sincerity, he practically broke out in sarcasm. Their marriage in 1795 was a disaster before the ink on the contract was dry. George reportedly arrived drunk, repulsed, and already plotting his escape. Caroline, for her part, was underwhelmed. She found him bloated and perfumed to death, more powdered mannequin than man. Their wedding night was less honeymoon and more diplomatic hostage exchange. 9 months later, a daughter, Princess Charlotte, was born, and that, as far as conjugal responsibilities went, was the end of that. Separated in everything but name, Caroline was quickly shuffled off the stage of English royal life and shipped abroad, not quite in exile, but not exactly welcomed either. What followed was a decade-long European escapade that the British court later tried to spin as a parade of impropriety. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. By the time Caroline took up residence in Italy, she had assembled a household that made Versailles look like a monastery. Her entourage included a cast of exotic dancers, low-ranking nobles, male companions, servants who became confidants, and one particularly memorable figure, Bartolomeo Pergami. He was her chamberlain. He was also tall, handsome, and travelled with her everywhere, including, as scandalous rumours insisted, into her bed. The British government, panicked by the optics of a future queen gallivanting across Europe with what they saw as a glorified valet, launched what would become known as the Milan Commission. Yes, they actually formed a commission to determine how scandalous she had been. Investigators were dispatched, gossip was harvested, and soon the English newspapers were drenched in tales of moonlit gondolas, seaside flirtations, and royal toes peeking out from behind locked bedroom doors. But the real genius of Caroline wasn't in the affairs themselves, it was in how unapologetically she didn't care. Unlike her husband, whose extramarital life was full of payoffs and hush-ups, Caroline's apparent response to scandal was, let them talk, and talk they did. When George IV finally ascended the throne in 1820, he tried to keep her out of England entirely. The government offered her money to stay away. She refused. Instead, she returned in a blaze of public glory. Crowds gathered to cheer her on as the wronged woman, the tragic queen, denied her rightful place. It was political theatre, and she played the role brilliantly. And then came the trial. Technically, it was a bill of pains and penalties, a legislative attempt to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve her marriage. In reality, it was a scandal circus. The House of Lords became a courtroom. Witnesses, mostly foreign servants, testified about alleged indecencies involving pergami. The nation tuned in like it was the 19th century version of reality TV. One servant claimed to have seen Caroline and Pergami kissing in a hallway. Another swore they shared a dressing room. The evidence was lurid, the tone was moralizing, and the verdict was never officially reached, because the public, as it turned out, loved Caroline. They didn't care about propriety, they cared about seeing the bloated hypocrisy of monarchy dragged into the daylight. George IV, with his mistresses and extravagance, suddenly looked a lot worse than his flamboyant wife, with a taste for Italian men. The bill was withdrawn. Caroline kept her title, but the victory was Pyrrhic. When she attempted to attend George's coronation in 1821, she was literally locked out of Westminster Abbey. 2 weeks later, she was dead. Now, historians still debate whether Caroline truly had as many lovers as rumoured, or whether the palace simply needed to paint her as a depraved foreigner to protect its own fragility. What we know for sure is this: she lived with audacity, died with drama, and left behind a legacy that forced the British Crown to look itself in the mirror and wince. But if Caroline's legend was built on rumour, passion, and public performance, the next queen on our list didn't even bother hiding her appetite. She simply owned it, from the day she buried a king to the day she took on the knights of France like trophies on a shelf. 2. Queen Isabella of Angoulême, circa 1188 to 1246. If you're going to be remembered for your scandalous behaviour, you might as well make sure it outlives your husband, preferably by several centuries. Queen Isabella of Angoulême did exactly that. She didn't just outlive her king, she buried his reputation, torched her own, and danced over the ashes in French silk. And yet, for all the centuries of judgment passed on her, one fact remains irritatingly persistent. Nobody could ever quite pin down whether she was a victim of politics or just the kind of woman who thoroughly enjoyed setting royal decorum on fire. When she married King John of England in 1200, Isabella was around 12 years old. That's not a euphemism, it's a medieval fact, and one of many deeply uncomfortable truths from that era. John, nearly 30 at the time and already divorced, took her as a political bride, not out of love or even lust, but to outmaneuver a rival noble house in Aquitaine. The marriage caused immediate political uproar. Isabella had been betrothed to Hugh of Lusignan, a powerful French noble, and John's intervention was not just personal, it was geopolitical theft. The result? War. More specifically, a long, drawn-out Anglo-French feud that cost England most of its territories on the continent. So, if you're keeping score, Isabella's marriage to John didn't just make her Queen of England, it helped trigger the collapse of England's power in France. Not bad for a teenager with a crown and no say in the matter. Now, if her story had ended there, she would have gone down in history as a passive character in a political drama. But Isabella was no passive queen. Even in her youth, contemporary chroniclers described her as striking, clever, and crucially, willful. Later, they drop the pretense entirely and call her more lascivious than a harlot. Subtle, they were not. When King John died in 1216, Isabella was only in her late 20s, wealthy, politically connected, and inconveniently alive. She was supposed to fade into the background, a dowager queen in the shadow of her son, the young Henry III. Instead, she packed up her jewels, left the English court behind, and returned to France, where she promptly resumed her role as a chaos agent with a royal seal. It was in France that her true reputation blossomed, or unravelled, depending on your moral compass. No longer tethered by English court protocols or a husband with a temper and a paranoia problem, Isabella moved into a world of her own making, and into the arms of many men, according to the chroniclers. The most famous of these was none other than her old almost husband, Hugh of Lusignan, the man she'd been taken from decades earlier. This time, she chose him. They married, but whether out of love, vengeance, or political alignment is still anyone's guess. Here's where things get murky and deliciously medieval. While married to Hugh, Isabella reportedly kept a lively household that was more courtly love salon than sober duchy. Numerous knights and nobles, especially the younger ones, found their way into her inner circle. And while the records are fuzzy, being both vague and slanderous, the suggestion was clear. She wasn't just running a household, she was curating a collection. The French chroniclers, already predisposed to despising her English connections, painted Isabella as a seductress, accusing her of having more lovers than a troubadour had songs. Her name became a punchline in monkish writings, often used to symbolize dangerous female desire wrapped in aristocratic silk. But the question that lingers is, were they reporting facts, or just punishing a woman for not staying quietly in her widowhood? Either way, Isabella didn't help her own reputation. She repeatedly meddled in politics, often against her own son. In one particularly bold move, she joined a plot against the French king. Not exactly the sort of thing you do if you're trying to maintain a low profile. When the plot failed, she fled into a nunnery. Not for penance, but for protection. Even her final years were soaked in suspicion. Though she officially withdrew from public life, rumors of secret meetings, secret lovers, and secret schemes followed her into the convent walls. When she died in 1246, she left behind no clean legacy, no sanitized memory for royal propagandists to polish. She was loved, hated, feared, desired, and above all, remembered. Today, Queen Isabella of Angoulême remains a figure half obscured by fog. Was she a medieval femme fatale, hungry for power and pleasure, or was she a sharp-witted survivor in a world where queens were used, discarded, and expected to disappear? Either way, she didn't disappear. She rewrote the ending. But if Isabella was the kind of queen who turned court gossip into a weapon, our next royal mystery involves a woman who didn't need whispers to cause fear. She had an entire civil war on her resume, and her passions may have helped start it. 2 royals down, 23 more to go. And trust us, it only gets more unhinged from here. If you're into forbidden liaisons, courtly chaos, and queens who gave historians migraines, hit that subscribe button now. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what ungodly hour have we pulled you into this royal mess? 3. Margaret of Anjou, 1430 to 1482. If England ever had a queen who could make kings disappear, crush armies and still be accused of having too much female influence, it was Margaret of Anjou. She wasn't born into the English monarchy. She stormed into it like a tempest, wrapped in silk, and what followed was a life lived at the crossroads of war, rumour and desire, all swirling beneath the flickering candlelight of a court that couldn't decide whether to revere her, fear her, or simply blame her for everything. Let's set the stage. Margaret was a French princess, born into the House of Valois, niece to the powerful King Charles VII of France. When she was married off at the age of 15 to England's King Henry VI, a man more devout than decisive, few suspected that she would soon become the de facto ruler of the realm. Henry was gentle, pious, and plagued by catatonic spells of mental illness that left him politically inert. That vacuum of power didn't stay empty for long. Margaret filled it. Almost immediately, the court began whispering. Why was the Queen speaking at council meetings? Why was she mediating between nobles? Why was she seen, horror of horrors, giving orders? To the conservative minds of 15th century England, a queen who acted like a king was unnatural, suspicious, dangerous. So naturally, they turned to the most time-tested political weapon available, rumours of sexual misconduct. The chroniclers, many of them sympathetic to Margaret's enemies, began seeding the idea that she was too close to certain men. Chief among them, Edmund Beaufort, the second Duke of Somerset, a powerful Lancastrian noble and frequent ally of Margaret. Somerset was rumoured to be more than just a political confidant. Some even speculated that her son, Prince Edward, was not Henry VI's child at all, but Somerset's. Now let's be clear. There's no hard evidence that Margaret was unfaithful, but in the court of public opinion, which at the time meant whatever some monk scribbled in the margins of a parchment, evidence was optional. What mattered was narrative, and the narrative was this: the king was weak, the queen was strong, and someone had to be sleeping their way into power. Still, Margaret didn't flinch. She doubled down. As tensions rose between the houses of Lancaster and York, Margaret didn't try to play the passive queen. She took up the banner of war. She raised armies. She rode into battle, sometimes literally, and personally rallied troops at the Battle of Wakefield and the Second Battle of St. Albans. Her enemies, many of whom already doubted her virtue, now feared her wrath. To the Yorkists, she became a villainess straight out of legend, seductive, ruthless, and foreign, a perfect scapegoat. They painted her as the Lady Macbeth of the Wars of the Roses, whispering poison into Henry's ear, plotting murders, staging coups. And always, at the centre of this dark portrait, was the insinuation that her lust for power wasn't just metaphorical. One of the more persistent rumours was that Margaret took multiple lovers among the Lancastrian lords, that her court was less a political council and more a royal boudoir. The names changed depending on the chronicler, but the implication was always the same. Margaret's influence couldn't be natural. She had to be seducing her way to command. Of course, these rumours conveniently ignored the political reality. Margaret didn't need lovers to manipulate anyone. She was smart, politically savvy, and more capable than half the men vying for the throne. But the English elite couldn't wrap their minds around a queen with agency. So they reduced her power to scandal. It didn't help that as the Wars of the Roses dragged on, Margaret's fortunes declined, her armies lost ground, her son was killed in battle, her husband was deposed twice. After the Yorkists gained control, Margaret was captured and imprisoned. Her image, once fearsome, now served as cautionary propaganda. This is what happens to ambitious women. She was eventually ransomed back to France, where she lived out her final years in near obscurity. No court, no power, no armies, just silence. But the rumours, those lived on. Some still claim she had secret lovers in her later years, that she plotted comebacks in the beds of French courtiers, that even in defeat she remained too dangerous to ignore. What's undeniable is this: Margaret of Anjou was a queen who ruled in a time when queens weren't supposed to rule, and for that she was labelled a seductress, a schemer, and a usurper of men's roles. Whether any of the whispered affairs were true or merely convenient slander, they fused to her legacy like wax to a royal seal. But if Margaret was a queen dragged into civil war and smeared for her ambition, the next woman on our list didn't need a battlefield to start a fire. She just needed a cocktail, a cigarette, and a phone number she'd regret dialing by morning. 4. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, 1930 to 2002. If ever there were a British royal who could turn scandal into an aesthetic, it was Princess Margaret. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II was born into privilege, raised in palaces, and destined to play second fiddle in the longest-running constitutional monarchy performance in history. And yet, she did something rare among royals. She refused to be boring. Margaret didn't just rebel, she turned rebellion into theatre. Not the radical kind, not the revolutionary kind, but the velvet-draped, cigarette-smoking, mid-century kind. Her scandals were curated, her lovers well-photographed, and her self-destruction strangely elegant. She was born in 1930 at Glamis Castle, the same place that inspired Macbeth, which feels fitting for someone whose life would be a tragedy played in perfect lipstick. Her early years were defined by royal routine. debutante balls, piano lessons, photo ops, but everything changed in 1936 when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne for love. Suddenly, her father became King George VI, and Margaret, age 6, went from decorative minor royal to a core member of the monarchy's inner circle. She wasn't amused. Unlike her older sister, Elizabeth, the diligent, measured future queen, Margaret had a sharp tongue, a dramatic streak, and an uncanny ability to attract exactly the sort of attention the royal household tried to avoid. She smoked in public, she laughed too loudly, she told bawdy jokes at state dinners, and, most fatally, she fell in love with entirely the wrong kind of man. Enter Group Captain Peter Townsend, handsome, war hero divorcee. Their romance was pure tabloid gold. It had everything: forbidden love, royal restrictions, and just enough plausible deniability to keep the British public glued to their newspapers. For years, Margaret waited. She delayed. She weighed her options. But in the end, under pressure from Church and Crown, she announced in 1955 that she would not marry him. It was the first heartbreak the public ever watched in slow motion. The young, radiant princess giving up love for duty. The sympathy was overwhelming for about 5 minutes, because what followed wasn't a life of solemn regret. It was a high-speed slide into cocktails, affairs, and the kind of social circles where royal titles were less valuable than a good party trick. Margaret became the queen of London's set. A loose cabal of aristocrats, artists, actors, and not-so-secret degenerates. Her companions included Mick Jagger, Peter Sellers, and Princess Grace of Monaco. She wore Dior, flirted with the press, and moved through Kensington Palace like she was starring in her own French noir film. Everyone wanted to be invited to her inner circle. Everyone also knew not to get too close. The lovers followed. Some discreet, most not. Actor Robin Douglas Home, the ill-fated liaison with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, became front-page scandal in the 1970s. Photos of them vacationing in Moustique, all tan limbs and gin-fueled sunburns, made it clear that Margaret had ceased caring about appearances. Or perhaps she had simply realized appearances were the only thing left. The tabloids adored her. She was a gift that kept giving. The chain-smoking princess in mirrored sunglasses, arriving late to funerals, glowering at cameras, and always seen with someone she shouldn't be seen with. The palace, meanwhile, looked on in muted horror. Every headline about Margaret was a reminder that the monarchy wasn't invincible, that even the most well-coiffed institution had cracks. Yet beneath the glamour and defiance was something more complicated. Margaret wasn't happy. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, the Earl of Snowdon, started as a passionate union of opposites. It ended in bitterness, affairs on both sides, and an icy silence worthy of a Chekhov play. He had lovers, she had lovers. Everyone in their house had lovers. By the 1970s, their relationship was less marriage and more emotional Cold War. In public, Margaret maintained the performance. The designer gowns, the high society dinners, the acerbic wit. But behind the scenes, she was isolated, increasingly ill, and haunted by what might have been. When she passed away in 2002, the British public mourned not just the princess, but the idea of her, the glamorous, flawed, impossible woman who had once seemed so alive, so reckless, so fun. To this day, Princess Margaret remains a cautionary tale with a cocktail in hand. Was she a tragic romantic, a hedonist lost in her own legend, a victim of a system that gave her power but no agency? Yes, yes, and then some. But while Margaret's scandals played out in the glare of flashbulbs, our next royal heroine lit her own fuse from behind palace walls, and when it finally exploded, the collateral damage was a crown, a kingdom, and one deeply unfortunate physician. 5. Lady Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, 1751 to 1775. If Princess Margaret was the royal family's scandalous lounge singer in a smoky Soho bar, then Lady Caroline Matilda was the full-blown operatic tragedy, complete with secret love, political downfall, and exile so cinematic you'd swear it was fiction. But it wasn't. It was Denmark. Caroline Matilda, the youngest daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and sister to the future King George III, was never supposed to matter much in the grand chessboard of European politics. That is, until she suddenly did. At the ripe old age of 15, she was married off to her first cousin, King Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch known more for his instability than his leadership. Theirs was not so much a marriage as it was a diplomatic shrug. Christian, eccentric and mentally unwell, was barely interested in ruling or in Caroline Matilda. She arrived in Copenhagen a foreign teenager, wrapped in expectation and brocade, and found herself in a palace where the walls whispered in Danish and the king disappeared for days. By all accounts, he neglected her almost immediately, and if the rumors are to be believed, he spent more time with his pet dog than with his new queen. In a different timeline, Caroline might have suffered in silence, become a shadowy royal wife, and been quietly forgotten. But fate, as it tends to, had other plans, and those plans came with a name: Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee wasn't born noble, he wasn't even born Danish. A German physician and intellectual, he wormed his way into Christian VII's court as a royal doctor, but quickly became something more, much more. His influence over the king grew rapidly, helped along by Christian's erratic behavior and Struensee's talent for knowing what people wanted to hear. Soon he was writing royal decrees, whispering policy, and reshaping Denmark under the banner of Enlightenment ideals, all while supposedly tending to the king's health. But what raised more eyebrows than Struensee's sudden political power was the nature of his relationship with Caroline Matilda. Now let's pause here, because this is where the history blurs with scandal. According to nearly every source, from sympathetic biographers to hostile court gossips, Caroline and Struensee didn't just share a mutual interest in books and progressive reform. They shared time, a lot of time, alone, frequently. And in the candlelit hothouse of the Danish court, already buzzing with tension, jealousy, and spycraft, that kind of intimacy didn't stay secret for long. The Queen and the Doctor became the center of whispered intrigue. He was seen entering her chambers late at night. She rode out with him on private excursions. Her court ladies noticed a new spring in her step, a smile not seen since her wedding day. And soon, the rumors weren't just whispered. They were carved into political pamphlets to the conservatives in Denmark. This was more than adultery. It was treason by way of ideology. Struensee was undoing centuries of aristocratic privilege with his reforms, and doing so while allegedly seducing the Queen. It was too much. A coup was inevitable. In January 1772, everything collapsed. The Queen was arrested and dragged from her bed in the dead of night. Struensee was seized as well. Within days, their private correspondence was exposed, their names dragged through every back alley of Copenhagen rumor. Struensee was swiftly tried and executed. Caroline Matilda, now disgraced, dethroned, and utterly alone, was exiled to Celle Castle in Hanover. She was 21 years old. In exile, she lived in a kind of suspended animation. She had no power, no court, no future. Her children, including a daughter widely suspected to have been fathered by Struensee, were taken from her. She spent her remaining years surrounded by reminders of the life she had briefly tasted, books, quiet gardens, and letters that never arrived. She died just 3 years later, at age 23, of what was officially declared scarlet fever. Unofficially, some said heartbreak, others poison. Still others believed she simply gave up. But Caroline Matilda remains a symbol of a certain kind of royal tragedy. the kind where passion and politics collide in a storm of inevitability. And yet, even centuries later, it's hard to shake the feeling that she was punished not just for loving unwisely, but for daring to live fully, even for a moment, in a world that wanted her invisible. Her story is a quiet warning. Don't fall in love with the wrong man in the right palace. Especially not if he has ideas, and especially not if those ideas threaten the old order. But if Caroline Matilda's downfall was ignited by romance wrapped in reform, our next royal scandal swirls beneath a more polished surface. A tale of whispers, polished piety, and flirtation so refined they nearly escaped the history books entirely. 6. Queen Mary II of England, 1662 to 1694. History tends to remember Queen Mary II as the pious half of England's most politically elegant power couple, the devout Protestant who co-ruled with her husband William of Orange after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. She was the one who sat still, looked regal, and made loyalty fashionable. Her public image was crafted so carefully that even the statues seemed to look away politely. But behind the polished portraits and parliamentary pageantry, Mary's personal life, though more discreet than some of her royal sisters, had a shadow side, a network of close friendships with men and courtiers that raised eyebrows, murmured gossip, and sparked accusations that would hover for centuries without ever landing cleanly. A queen so beloved for her virtue may have had just enough temptation in her orbit to make virtue look suspiciously convenient. She was born in 1662 to James, Duke of York, later King James II, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. Her childhood was filled with religious tension, family instability, and the ever-present knowledge that everything about her future would be arranged, not chosen. By the time she was 15, Mary was married off to her cousin William of Orange, a match more political than personal, and one she reportedly wept over when first told. William was older, stern, and emotionally distant. He was also intensely devoted to Protestantism and the idea of kingship as divine duty. Their marriage, while outwardly respectful and productive in terms of alliance building, was rarely described as passionate. In letters, Mary called him Dear William, but the tone was more dutiful than romantic, like a woman writing her landlord a thank you note for not raising the rent. Still, she played the part well. When James II was ousted in the Glorious Revolution and Mary and William took the throne, she was widely viewed as the acceptable face of the monarchy, Protestant, poised, and politically passive. She deferred to William publicly, rarely voiced opinions of her own, and seemed to occupy her time with embroidery, charity work, and Anglican conformity. Except there were the friendships. Queen Mary, for all her outward piety, maintained a curiously intense series of relationships with male courtiers. Some were brushed off as platonic, others were quietly moved to distant posts. A few disappeared from the historical record entirely. One of the most talked about was with Sidney Godolphin, a Tory statesman known for his discretion and intelligence. Their correspondence suggested a closeness that made Mary's inner circle nervous. Godolphin was not flamboyant, far from it, but there were murmurs that his access to the Queen's private chambers was too frequent, too unchaperoned, too permitted. Then there was Henry Sidney, another trusted figure at court. Mary's conversations with Sidney were reportedly long, personal, and often conducted without the expected formality. At a time when royal marriages were rigid performances and every glance was choreographed with Mary's ease with Sidney looked suspicious, not because of what anyone saw, but because of what they weren't allowed to see. Even the Dutch ambassador raised an eyebrow, noting that Mary had favourites among her gentlemen courtiers, a phrase that, in court language, often meant something more than chess partners. But the most damning suggestion came from pamphlets circulated anonymously in the early 1690s, implying that Mary had become too emotionally intimate with a string of younger men, some with no political clout, others whose names were conveniently forgotten. While the accusations were never formally investigated, such things were too delicate for Parliament, they lived on in the corners of court gossip, especially among those who viewed Mary's moral facade as a little too flawless to be real. Her defenders argued she was simply warm-hearted, friendly, and in need of companionship during William's long absences. And that may well be true, but the line between emotional intimacy and something more was razor-thin at a court where proximity meant power, and where queens were expected to suppress all human urges beneath an embroidered bodice and a blank, dutiful smile. And then came the final irony. After a short reign marked by political stability and personal speculation, Mary fell gravely ill with smallpox in 1694. As she neared death, her reputation was again wrapped in sanctity. She was mourned as a model queen, a pious consort, a woman who had never once wavered from the path of righteousness. History, always eager to tidy things up, largely obliged. The rumours faded, the letters disappeared, and Mary II was embalmed, figuratively and literally, as a figure of virtuous royalty. But for those who read between the lines, something lingers. A queen whose official biography was too clean, whose affections were too private, and whose closest friendships seemed just a little too well hidden. Perhaps she wasn't the Virgin Queen, but she knew how to dress like one. And if Mary II left behind little more than a whisper of mystery, our next royal made sure her legend would roar, a queen who wore her scandals like battle armor and made even the Crusades look like a sideshow to her love life. 7. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1122 to 1204. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just outlive her husbands, she outlasted empires, crusades, and the very idea of what a woman in power was supposed to be. She was Queen of France, Queen of England, mother to 10 children, 2 of whom became kings, and somehow still found time to be the most whispered about woman in medieval Europe. Her legacy was written not in quiet domesticity, but in songs, seductions, rebellions, and a well-cultivated reputation for being too much, too powerful, too intelligent, and yes, far too intimate with far too many men, for the tastes of the monastic chroniclers who tried in vain to pin her down. Born in 1122 as the Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited one of the richest and most cultured regions in France, a land of troubadours, poetry, and chivalric courts where passion was not only tolerated but expected. She was fluent in Latin, versed in law, and more politically astute than most of the men who would go on to rule her. At 15, she married Louis VII of France. At 29, she divorced him, and in between, she scandalized every cathedral from Paris to Jerusalem. Her first marriage was a mismatch from the start. Louis, originally intended for the church, was pious and gentle, more monk than monarch. Eleanor, on the other hand, brought a taste for lavish court life and emotional firepower that made the entire French court either fall in love with her or resent her, sometimes both. When the couple joined the Second Crusade in 1147, she didn't travel as an accessory. She rode in armor, leading her own vassals. The sight of the Queen charging through the Holy Land beside her husband sent half of Europe into a moral tailspin, and it only got better, or worse, depending on your appetite for royal chaos. Rumors quickly spread that Eleanor was far too close with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the dashing Prince of Antioch. Chroniclers accused her of riding with him unchaperoned, speaking to him with unseemly familiarity, and refusing to leave Antioch when Louis demanded it. The scandal was so potent that many believe it marked the beginning of the end of her marriage to Louis. When they finally divorced in 1152, the church allowed it on the grounds of consanguinity, a fancy word for we were too closely related, which somehow took 15 years to notice. And then came the real twist. 8 weeks later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the soon-to-be King Henry II of England. No mourning period, no downtime, just a strategic leap from one throne to the next. If her French courtiers were scandalized before, they were positively undone now. With Henry, Eleanor gave birth to 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John, yes, that King John. Their marriage, though initially passionate, spiraled into a legendary power struggle. Eleanor wasn't content to sit back and produce heirs. She governed her own lands, ran courts of law and maintained a glittering court in Poitiers that became the epicenter of the so-called Court of Love. There, she surrounded herself with poets, artists, philosophers, and men. Lots of them. Some were advisors, some were troubadours, some were knights whose praises she sang just a little too loudly. The lines between affection, patronage, and passion blurred beyond recognition. One particularly persistent rumor held that Eleanor had been romantically involved with Geoffrey, Henry's own illegitimate half-brother. Others suggested she shared more than court politics with her son Richard's close companions, and always the implication was the same. Eleanor's power came not from bloodlines or law, but from seduction. It was slander, of course, or, at the very least, convenient projection. Men who ruled with charisma were celebrated. Women who did the same were accused of debauchery, and Eleanor, for all her actual political genius, was repeatedly recast as the archetype of the dangerous, oversexed woman, too clever for the convent, too powerful for her station. In 1173, she joined her sons in a rebellion against Henry II. For that, she was imprisoned for over 15 years. While Henry indulged in his own long-standing affair with Rosamond Clifford, Eleanor was locked away in semi-house arrest, written out of politics, but never out of history. When Henry died, she emerged once more, ruling as regent while Richard waged war abroad. She was nearly 70 and still negotiating with popes, arranging royal marriages, and asserting herself across Europe. She died in 1204, aged 82, leaving behind a dynasty that would shape England and France for generations, and a reputation as a woman who ruled like a king, spoke like a poet, and lived like someone who'd read the end of the rulebook and decided to write her own. So yes, the rumors of lovers and liaisons never really stopped, but maybe that was the point. Eleanor refused to be reduced to obedience or ornamentation. She was a queen twice over, a mother of kings, and a woman whose passions, real or imagined, frightened her enemies more than any army ever could. And if Eleanor redefined what it meant to be a medieval queen, our next subject would redefine what it meant to be single, royally single, in an age that demanded submission, while she quietly collected power, poetry, and a suspicious number of handsome courtiers. 8. Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. They called her the Virgin Queen, not just as a political brand, but as a public vow, a symbolic virtue, and, for Elizabeth I, a lifelong trap she turned into a weapon. It was a crown of chastity, forged by necessity, worn with theatrical flair, and wielded with a subtle menace that terrified suitors, courtiers, and even entire nations. Whether or not she actually lived up to the title is a question that historians still dance around, like they're afraid she might rise from the grave and correct their punctuation. Born into scandal as the daughter of Henry VIII and the infamous Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth was a royal paradox from the start. Too clever to be ignored, too dangerous to be married off, and far too independent for a world that demanded queens stay quiet and fruitful. Her early life was shaped by court intrigue, religious whiplash, and the kind of family dysfunction that would make modern tabloids blush. One day she was a princess, the next declared illegitimate, then reinstated, then threatened, then imprisoned. And somehow, through it all, she learned the one rule that mattered in Tudor politics: trust no one, especially the ones who say they love you. By the time she ascended the throne in 1558 at the age of 25, Elizabeth had already survived more political assassinations of character than most monarchs endure in a lifetime. And once crowned, she made a choice, a bold, public, meticulously calculated choice to never marry. At least, not officially. But here's where the myth gets smoky. Because while Elizabeth remained legally single, her heart and her court was far from empty. She surrounded herself with men, noblemen, diplomats, poets, pirates. Some became favorites, some became legends, a few became warnings, and all of them, in some way or another, were entangled in the question, did Elizabeth really live as the Virgin Queen, or was it the greatest branding campaign in royal history? First and foremost was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Childhood friend, constant companion, and, according to half of Europe, her secret lover. Dudley was everything a Tudor court could love and fear. Charming, ambitious, and married to someone else. His wife, Amy Robsart, died under mysterious circumstances in 1560 after falling down a staircase, which only deepened the suspicion around their relationship. Although Elizabeth never married him, their connection was unmistakable. She gave him private rooms near hers, wrote him flirtatious letters, and called him her eyes. Even ambassadors commented on their closeness. One wrote that he was so often in her chambers, it was unclear who ruled whom. Then came Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, poet, professional flatterer, a man whose courtship of Elizabeth was more literary than literal. He read her poetry. She gave him land. He gave her compliments laced with ambition. And then, of course, he married one of her ladies-in-waiting. In secret, Elizabeth, famously possessive of her inner circle, responded not with forgiveness, but with jail time. Raleigh spent time in the Tower of London for the crime of romantic disloyalty, a reminder that while the Queen might not marry, her jealousy still had teeth. And then there was Robert Devereux, the dashing Earl of Essex, young enough to be her son, bold enough to flirt with treason. Elizabeth adored him. She also had him executed. Their relationship was a roller coaster of patronage, rage, political tension, and barely disguised romantic drama. He called her sweet eyes. She once boxed his ears in public. Their downfall came after Essex led a failed rebellion, thinking somehow that he could charm his way out of a death sentence. He could not. Of course, Elizabeth also entertained foreign suitors. The French Duke of Anjou, for instance, whom she famously nicknamed her Frog, was briefly considered a viable match. She strung him along just long enough to extract diplomatic advantages and then politely declined. The Spanish and the Austrians sent their proposals too, and Elizabeth entertained them, publicly, theatrically, always promising, never delivering. The reality is that Elizabeth's love life, like her reign, was performative and strategic. Whether or not she ever had physical relationships is, frankly, beside the point. What mattered was the power it gave her, the ability to dangle herself as a potential bride without ever surrendering control. She turned courtship into policy. She made flirtation into statecraft. She embodied desire while denying satisfaction. And in doing so, she rewrote the script for queenship. But for all the flirtations and fierce declarations of independence, Elizabeth's personal life was never without cost. She died alone, with no heir, no spouse, and a carefully curated image that still hangs over British history like a shroud of pearls. Her virginity became a monument, her suitors became footnotes, and the woman herself, brilliant, strategic, complicated, became a myth with lipstick and a crown. And yet, for all her restraint and rhetorical seduction, the Queen who followed in our list took a far messier path. Her passions weren't wrapped in symbolism, they were wrapped in blood, betrayal, and the burning wreckage of a monarchy that couldn't quite keep her under control. 9. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1587. If Queen Elizabeth I was the ice-cold tactician who played the long game with velvet gloves, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the firebrand who tried to play by the same rules, except her gloves were usually off, her heart too involved, and the game rigged from the start. She ruled 3 kingdoms, buried 3 husbands, and left behind more conspiracy theories than official portraits. Her downfall wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a soap opera written in Latin, lit by candlelight, and performed before a horrified court that couldn't look away. Mary was born into chaos. Just 6 days old when she inherited the Scottish throne, her reign began before she could even hold her own head up. Scotland at the time was not exactly child-proof. It was factional, violent, and largely ruled by noble families who preferred swords to diplomacy. So, like any well-meaning set of regents trying to keep a baby queen alive, her advisors shipped her off to France, where she was raised in splendor at the French court and married off to the heir, Francis II. For a time, it worked. She became Queen Consort of France at 16. But when Francis died of illness a year later, Mary, now widowed, stateless, and politically radioactive, was forced to return to Scotland, a place she hadn't seen since infancy, and that greeted her less like a queen and more like an unwelcome relative at a family funeral. Back in Scotland, Mary faced 3 enormous problems: a divided nobility, a Protestant Reformation already in full swing, she was Catholic, and a personal life that moved like a slow-motion train wreck through the thistle-covered countryside. Her first mistake, or what her enemies called a mistake, was marrying her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. On paper, it was a solid political move. Darnley was tall, attractive, and had a royal bloodline to match Mary's own. In practice, he was also arrogant, insecure, and deeply disliked by basically everyone who met him, including Mary. The marriage unraveled almost immediately. Darnley's jealousy became violent, his drunkenness legendary. And when Mary gave birth to their son James, yes, that James, who would later become James VI of Scotland and James I of England, Darnley responded not with joy, but suspicion. Then came the murder. In 1566, Mary's secretary and rumoured confidant David Rizzio was stabbed to death in front of her during dinner, allegedly orchestrated by Darnley himself and a handful of paranoid nobles. Whether Mary and Rizzio were actually lovers is unclear, but the rumour stuck, and the brutality of the killing ensured that every whisper afterward was heard at full volume. Soon after, Darnley himself was found dead under mysterious circumstances, his body lying in a garden outside a house that had just exploded. He wasn't burned, he had no visible injuries, which naturally only made the situation more suspicious. The prime suspect, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man Mary would marry just weeks later. And that was it. The final straw. The Scottish nobles, already wary of her foreign ways and religious loyalty, now saw her as morally compromised, politically reckless, and possibly complicit in the murder of her own husband. The marriage to Bothwell was never accepted by the public. Some claimed he kidnapped her. Others said she went willingly. Either way, the fallout was swift and brutal. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, and watched her world collapse from inside a damp stone cell. But Mary was not one to stay quiet. She escaped, raised an army, and tried to reclaim her throne. It failed. She fled to England, hoping for asylum from her cousin Elizabeth. Instead, she got 19 years of comfortable captivity, part guest, part prisoner, part political liability that no one knew how to deal with. All the while, the rumours never stopped. Mary was linked to countless plots, some proven, some probably invented. The most famous was the Babington Plot, a Catholic plan to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the English throne. Whether she approved it is still debated, but her name was found in the letters, and that was enough. She was tried, convicted, and executed in 1587, but her image refused to die. To her supporters, Mary became a Catholic martyr, beautiful, tragic, betrayed. To her detractors, she was a reckless queen whose romantic entanglements and poor political judgment doomed her crown and her life. And to modern historians, she remains a riddle, part victim, part agent of her own downfall, part woman who simply lived in a time that punished women for wanting anything at all. She ruled too boldly, loved too freely, and paid too dearly. And yet her legacy lived on, in poetry, portraits, and the son she left behind, who would do what she never could, unite the thrones of Scotland and England. But if Mary's downfall came through a string of poor romantic decisions wrapped in political naivety, our next royal didn't even get the benefit of hindsight. She walked straight into scandal with open eyes, whispering secrets in gardens and corridors until even the king couldn't pretend not to notice. 10. Catherine Howard, circa 1523 to 1542. If ever there was a cautionary tale written in velvet and youth, it was Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII, cousin to Anne Boleyn, and the brief, dazzling spark that flickered across the Tudor court before being snuffed out with royal efficiency. Her story, often reduced to a punchline about teenage folly and courtly indiscretion, is in truth a haunting portrait of how desire, power, and reputation collide, especially when the crown is watching. Catherine was born into the powerful Howard family, a noble house known more for its ambition than its discretion. By the time she arrived on the royal scene, the Howards had already placed one daughter, Anne Boleyn, on the throne and seen her fall, quite literally, from it. You'd think that kind of family trauma might instill a bit of caution. It didn't. Catherine grew up in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a noblewoman more interested in courtly survival than in the moral guidance of her young charges. In that strange semi-parental arrangement, Catherine was left largely to her own devices, mingling with other adolescent wards, sneaking around at night, and reportedly forming attachments that would later come back to haunt her. But at the time, she was just another pretty face in a house full of aristocratic gossip and very few locked doors. Enter King Henry VIII, now in his late 40s, wide of waist and increasingly paranoid. Fresh off his disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union he found so physically repellent he allegedly couldn't bring himself to consummate it, Henry was in need of distraction. And there Catherine was, young, vibrant, and everything the court needed to believe in again. She was roughly 16 or 17. He was more than twice her age. The political machinery kicked into gear. Their courtship was swift, though courtship is perhaps too generous a term. Catherine, ambitious or simply swept up in the moment, played the role expected of her. She was crowned queen in 1540, a glittering ornament beside an aging monarch who described her as his rose without a thorn. It was not a compliment designed for longevity. From the start, there were whispers. The speed of her rise, the ease with which she charmed the court, and her prior associations made her both admired and suspect. Among the most persistent rumours was her earlier relationship with Francis Dereham, a gentleman usher from her days in the Dowager Duchess's household. Some claimed they had exchanged vows in a sort of informal engagement. Others insisted the relationship had gone much further. Either way, it was unwise history for a queen. Then came Thomas Culpeper, a young courtier with striking features and just enough access to the queen to make things interesting. Culpeper was rumoured to have spent time alone with Catherine behind closed doors, sometimes at night, sometimes with the help of one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn. Yes, the widow of George Boleyn, Anne's brother, because in Tudor history everything is connected. Letters were said to have passed between Catherine and Culpeper, the kind of notes that don't get written unless something very private is being said. Whether they were lovers in the full sense of the word remains speculative. What matters more is what people believed. In 1541, the whole tangled affair began to unravel. Enemies at court, sensing blood in the water, began feeding information to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. One anonymous letter later, and suddenly Catherine was no longer just the king's young bride. She was a security risk. The investigation that followed was brutal in its speed. Servants were interrogated, confessions were extracted, private conversations were reconstructed from fragments and half-truths. Derham was arrested and quickly turned on Culpeper, dragging the Queen's name through every corridor of court memory. The evidence, circumstantial, gossipy, and salacious, was enough. Culpeper and Derham were executed. Catherine was stripped of her title, placed under house arrest, and eventually confined to the Tower. She never saw the king again. Her fall was Shakespearean in its velocity. One moment she was the Queen of England walking the palace gardens in silk. The next she was alone in a cell, watching the machinery of monarchy grind her name into scandal. She was executed in February 1542, barely 19 years old. History, in its typically neat fashion, turned Catherine into a symbol, a reckless girl, a foolish flirt, a tragic echo of her cousin Anne Boleyn. But the truth, as always, is messier. Catherine was a teenager in a world built for men, praised for her beauty, punished for her curiosity, and destroyed by a system that pretended her crown gave her power while making sure it never truly did. Her story isn't just one of scandal, it's one of vulnerability weaponized by power. She may have been queen, but she was never safe, not in that court, not in that era, and certainly not with Henry. But if Catherine's undoing came from youthful risk and royal suspicion, the next queen in our series learned how to turn the rumour mill to her advantage, an expert in appearances, ambition, and a charm that even her enemies couldn't quite resist. 11. Anne Boleyn. Circa 1501 to 1536, Anne Boleyn didn't walk into history. She stormed into it, eyes up, sleeves puffed, and a sense of purpose sharp enough to cut through Tudor protocol like a blade through brocade. For some, she was the Protestant heroine who toppled the medieval world order. For others, the homewrecker who destroyed England's most sacred institution, the church and the marriage bed of a very entitled king. But regardless of the angle, one thing was certain. Anne wasn't just whispered about. She was shouted about, blamed, obsessed over, and finally obliterated. Before she was a queen, she was a mystery. Born to a moderately ambitious noble family, Anne was educated abroad in the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France. There, she absorbed not just languages and etiquette, but also that elusive, intoxicating quality that most English courtiers lacked: style. She returned to England, not a demure English rose, but a cultivated, self-possessed woman, fluent in flirtation and power dynamics. By the time she caught the eye of King Henry VIII, Anne had already served as a lady-in-waiting to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Her older sister, Mary Boleyn, had already shared the king's bed and been discarded quietly and efficiently. Anne was supposed to be next, a quick affair, a decorative interlude, but she refused. Whether by strategy or sincere conviction, she said no. And Henry, a man not used to being denied, became interested. What followed was a 7-year pursuit, one of the most obsessive, prolonged seductions in royal history. Henry wrote her love letters full of florid metaphors and oddly desperate tone. He gave her jewels, titles, and eventually a promise to make her queen. But that required something England had never done before: annul a royal marriage on the grounds of spiritual inconvenience. Catherine had failed to produce a male heir. Anne would, Henry believed, deliver one. Anne's rise was dazzling and dangerous. As she waited for Henry to untangle himself from Rome, she amassed enemies faster than allies. Courtiers who had once tolerated her as a flirtatious distraction now saw her as a threat to the entire kingdom. Even Thomas More, a man Henry once revered, refused to acknowledge Anne's queenship, and paid for it with his life. When Anne and Henry finally married in secret in 1533 and then publicly crowned her queen shortly after, she was already pregnant. The child was a girl, not the son they'd promised each other in so many breathless exchanges, but Elizabeth, yes, that Elizabeth, who would one day outlive them all. For Anne, though, the birth of a daughter marked the beginning of a slow, terrifying unravelling. She had made herself Queen of England through defiance and charm. Now she was expected to deliver male heirs and peace. She delivered wit, opinions, more miscarriages, and a court atmosphere thick with suspicion. Anne was not the docile Tudor wife people wanted. She spoke her mind. She advocated for religious reform. She openly clashed with powerful courtiers and, most dangerously, with Henry himself. And then came the rumours. Anne, it was said, had lovers, too many to count. Musicians, courtiers, even her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were absurdly theatrical, riddled with contradictions, and likely fabricated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's fixer and political strategist. But they stuck. After 3 miscarriages and Henry's wandering eye turning toward Jane Seymour, Anne became vulnerable, not just unpopular, but expendable. In May 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges: adultery, incest, treason. The evidence: dubious conversations, coerced confessions, and the king's suddenly convenient willingness to believe what suited him. 5 men were executed, including George Boleyn. Anne was tried and found guilty by a jury of her enemies. She defended herself with eloquence and composure, even as the walls closed in. On May 19th, she was executed by a specially imported French swordsman, a grim courtesy for a woman whose only real crime may have been being smarter and more visible than any woman in Henry's orbit dared to be. But death, ironically, did not end her presence. Anne became legend. To Protestants, she was a martyr. To Catholics, a harlot. To feminists, a victim of patriarchy. To historians, an enigma. And through it all, one persistent, haunting theme followed her: that her downfall wasn't just political or religious, it was personal. A woman accused not merely of ambition, but of appetites, of being too confident, too magnetic, too intimate, too unwilling to play the silent consort. Was there truth in the charges? It hardly mattered. The myth had already taken shape, and in the myth, Anne Boleyn is forever the queen who dared to think power might also belong to her. But if Anne was punished for challenging the order from the king's side, the next royal in our story didn't challenge from the throne. She slipped into it from the shadows, wrapped in rumours, and kept her secrets in the pockets of silk gowns lined with strategy. 12. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, 1437 to 1492. Elizabeth Woodville was not supposed to be queen. She wasn't born into royalty. She didn't bring a sprawling alliance, a European dowry, or a grand political strategy with her when she arrived at court. What she brought was beauty, mystery, and perhaps, most dangerous of all, audacity. Hers was a romance that rewrote the rules of English kingship and a life tangled in whispers, allegiances, and rumours of appetites that extended far beyond the throne. Before she became Queen of England, Elizabeth was the widow of a Lancastrian knight, Sir John Grey, who died fighting against the very man she would later marry, Edward IV. That should have disqualified her from royal favour. Instead, it turned her into a cautionary myth. The widow who stood by the roadside with her 2 sons, dressed in mourning, waiting for the king to pass by so she could plead for her lands to be restored. She got her lands, and the king's heart. At least that's the story England was told. The more cynical version goes like this. Elizabeth Woodville was not a grieving widow, but an ambitious woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She presented herself not just as a supplicant, but as a temptation too tantalizing to resist. Edward IV, already known for his passion and impulsive decision-making, married her in secret in 1464. a commoner, a Lancastrian, a widow. It was, by any political measure, a disaster, and it was done entirely without the consent or even the knowledge of Edward's advisers. The reaction at court was volcanic. Noble families were outraged. Foreign dignitaries were dumbfounded. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, had spent years planning an alliance between Edward and a French princess. All wasted. Elizabeth had walked into the game and flipped the board. But it wasn't just the marriage that caused trouble, it was what came next. Elizabeth brought with her not only beauty and poise, but a family, a large, ambitious one. The Woodvilles, previously considered minor nobility, suddenly found themselves married into the peerage, seated at court, and rising faster than anyone could comfortably explain. Her brothers became lords. Her sisters married powerful men. Her father was made Earl Rivers. To some, it looked like a dynasty being built in plain sight, one not of royal blood, but of strategic bedchambers. And so began the rumours. The court gossips painted Elizabeth not as a queen, but as a seductress, one who had ensnared the king through witchcraft, manipulation, or worse. Her enemies said she used her beauty to turn Edward into a puppet, then used her family to pull the strings. Some claimed her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, had dabbled in the occult, passing down the power of seduction like a family heirloom. Whether or not anyone believed these stories didn't matter. They were convenient, and they stuck. Elizabeth was accused of playing matchmaker for her ladies-in-waiting, arranging marriages that doubled as political weapons. She was said to have kept confidants dangerously close, young men of court who lingered a little too long in her presence. Letters were passed, smiles were observed, protocols occasionally were forgotten. It didn't help that Edward IV was no model of fidelity himself. He had numerous mistresses, many of whom were well known. But while his affairs were dismissed as harmless diversions, Elizabeth's supposed liaisons, most of which remain unproven, were cast as calculated and dangerous. Where Edward was called passionate, Elizabeth was called conniving. The double standard was clear, and it was brutal. After Edward's sudden death in 1483, Elizabeth's world began to collapse. Her sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were taken into the custody of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The boys disappeared into the Tower of London and were never seen again. Richard declared them illegitimate and crowned himself Richard III. Elizabeth, once the power behind the throne, now found herself hiding in Westminster Abbey, stripped of influence, clutching the remnants of her family like a queen exiled in her own city. Even then, the rumours didn't stop. Some claimed she plotted from the shadows, arranging secret alliances and manipulating her surviving children into advantageous positions. When her daughter Elizabeth of York married Henry VII and united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, it was seen as Elizabeth Woodville's final masterstroke, one last move in a lifelong chess game. She died in relative obscurity in 1492, after retreating from court and living under a cloud of suspicion and royal fatigue. Her final years were quiet, but her legacy wasn't. She had risen from obscurity to become queen, mother of a king, and grandmother to the first Tudor monarch. Along the way, she shattered expectations and paid the price for it. Was she truly promiscuous, as her enemies claimed, or was she simply a woman of agency in an age that punished women for using it? The answer, like Elizabeth herself, refuses to be simple. But if Elizabeth Woodville used charm, wit, and family strategy to climb the ladder, the next royal on our list didn't even get a chance to grow into power, because the rumours about her started before she could legally vote, and ended only after death turned scandal into legend. 13. Princess Charlotte of Wales, 1796 to 1870. Princess Charlotte of Wales was supposed to be the redemption arc of the British monarchy, the one royal who might reconcile a bitterly divided court, calm the chaos of her scandal-ridden parents, and usher in a new, untarnished generation of royalty. Instead, she became something else entirely, a flash of charisma too brilliant to last, a figure romanticized beyond recognition, and a young woman whose personal life was already the stuff of whispered legend long before she died at 21. She was born into dysfunction. Her father, the future King George IV, was notorious for his extravagance, vanity, and inability to keep a private matter private. Her mother, Caroline of Brunswick, was no stranger to scandal either. In fact, we've already met her in this list for reasons that will soon feel uncomfortably familiar. Their marriage was a textbook disaster, loveless, cold, and punctuated by public brawls and private betrayals. Charlotte was their only child, and from the moment of her birth she became less a daughter and more a pawn in a royal custody battle soaked in resentment. She was raised largely apart from both parents, shuffled between residences like a diplomatic football. Her tutors were selected more for their loyalty to political factions than for their educational qualifications. Her friendships were monitored, her letters were read, her wardrobe was inspected for signs of rebellious tailoring. And yet, through all of it, Charlotte managed to become something rare in the royal world, relatable. She was quick-witted, emotionally volatile, deeply opinionated, and astonishingly modern in her refusal to play the demure decorative role expected of royal daughters. She clashed with her handlers. She read voraciously. She mocked the pretensions of the court with the kind of deadpan sarcasm that would have made her a sensation in the age of Twitter. And then there were the men. The first major scandal came with Captain Charles Hesse, a striking officer whose presence in Charlotte's orbit quickly evolved from passing acquaintance to subject of intense scrutiny. Whether their relationship was truly romantic or just emotional theatre is unclear, but the gossip was immediate and enduring. He was older, not royal, and allegedly just charming enough to become a distraction. Charlotte's family was horrified. The match was forbidden. Hesse was sent away. Charlotte was reminded once again that her body, heart, and future belonged not to herself, but to the crown. She didn't agree. Next came a series of other potential suitors, each vetted and negotiated like livestock, including Prince William of Orange, who was offered to her like a royal peace treaty in human form. Charlotte met him, smiled politely, then refused him spectacularly, publicly, with all the subtlety of a cannonball. Her reason? She simply didn't like him. That was enough for her, but not for the crown. Charlotte's rebellion sent shockwaves through the establishment. A princess refusing a foreign alliance, a royal daughter declaring her own preferences. The court panicked, the press had a field day, and Charlotte, to her credit, remained unbothered. Eventually she fell for Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a quiet, intelligent, emotionally stable man who stood in stark contrast to the chaotic swirl of her family life. He was not a grand political prize, but he was a calming presence, and Charlotte wanted him. The crown, exhausted and out of options, relented. They married in 1816. For once, the nation cheered. Charlotte and Leopold became the fairy tale couple, young, hopeful, and free of the rot that had infected so much of the royal tree. Their marriage was brief, but reportedly happy. Charlotte seemed settled, fulfilled, even content. But of course, in a story like this, contentment never lasts. In 1817, after a harrowing 50-hour labor, Charlotte gave birth to a stillborn son. Hours later, she herself died of complications. The nation was devastated. Mourners lined the streets, shops closed in mourning, people wept in public as if a living symbol of hope had been extinguished, because it had. But in death, Charlotte became something else, a canvas. And like all canvases, people painted what they wanted to see. The innocent princess, the spirited rebel, the tragic bride, the future queen who never was. What got left out of the official version was the messier part. The men, the flirtations, the rumors of earlier dalliances with officers, musicians, and gentlemen of questionable repute. whispers of letters destroyed, names forgotten, and late-night walks in gardens that were probably just for the air. Were any of the rumors true? Possibly. Was Charlotte unusually passionate for her time? Almost certainly. But to reduce her to her scandals is to miss the point. She was a royal woman who wanted a life that belonged to her, and in the gilded cage of early 19th century monarchy, that alone was radical. And yet, if Charlotte's brief, blazing life left England mourning what might have been, the next woman in our descent into royal infamy was less a symbol of lost potential and more a living provocation, a woman whose secrets weren't whispered after her death, but shouted as she ran for the door with her forbidden lover. 14. Lady Arabella Stuart, 1575 to 1615. Lady Arabella Stuart wasn't just born close to the throne, she was born dangerously close. With royal blood running through her veins and the shadow of Elizabeth I looming overhead, Arabella existed in a strange twilight zone of power and paranoia. Too noble to be ignored, too connected to be trusted, and just reckless enough to earn her place in history's most whispered-about files. Her name rarely appears in the glittering tapestries of kings and queens, but behind the court curtains she was a scandal waiting to happen. And inevitably, she did. She was the great-granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, which made her a legitimate claimant to the English throne. In an age when succession was both a national obsession and a political death trap, this was less of a gift and more of a ticking time bomb. From childhood, Arabella was kept under a kind of royal house arrest, not quite imprisoned, but not quite free, always watched, always managed. Her presence at court was limited, her friendships filtered, her suitors vetted like foreign spies. And yet, despite this gilded surveillance, Arabella was not the demure, biddable, noble woman the crown hoped she'd be. She was sharp-witted, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of that most inconvenient quality for a royal woman in waiting: imagination, and possibly a taste for risk. From the moment she reached marriageable age, Arabella's name was a subject of delicate diplomatic maneuvering. She was linked to a variety of noblemen, both foreign and domestic, any of whom could have turned her into a political lightning rod. But the real scandal didn't come from the ones she might have married, it came from the one she did. In 1610, in a move so audacious it still feels like a plot twist, Arabella secretly married William Seymour, the grandson of Lady Catherine Grey and another serious contender in the royal bloodline bingo. Their union was both romantic and, in the eyes of King James I, deeply subversive. Two royal claimants marrying without the monarch's permission was not just a breach of protocol, it was a potential threat to the entire succession. Arabella and William knew this, which is likely why they did it in secret. When the marriage was discovered, King James reacted with all the grace of a monarch whose throne had just been flirted with. William was thrown into the Tower of London. Arabella was placed under house arrest. Their letters were intercepted. Their visitors were restricted. But even separated, the two continued to communicate in code, plotting a plan that would become one of the most tragically ambitious romantic escapes in royal history. In 1611, Arabella disguised herself as a man and fled her confinement, attempting to reunite with William so they could escape to France. For a brief, glittering moment, the plan almost worked. Arabella boarded a ship. Freedom was on the horizon. Then everything fell apart. William, delayed in joining her, missed the rendezvous. Arabella was captured mid-voyage and returned to England. William did make it to the continent and lived in exile. Arabella, however, was not so fortunate. She was imprisoned in the Tower, a symbolic punishment for a woman whose greatest crime had been marrying for love without asking permission. Over the next 4 years, she spiraled into isolation and declining health. Her appeals for mercy were ignored. Her political significance faded. The court, now satisfied she was no longer a threat, let her slowly vanish. She died in 1615, reportedly of illness, possibly compounded by grief, definitely alone. But of course, the official record tells only part of the story. Arabella's romantic life was a subject of endless speculation at court. Some believed William Seymour was not her first lover, only the most dangerous. Whispers of early entanglements with ambitious courtiers, furtive glances exchanged during court masques, and locked doors during extended stays at noble houses all floated around long after her death. The truth, it hardly matters, because whether Arabella Stuart truly had a string of lovers or merely one forbidden husband, her reputation became a prism, refracting fear, fantasy, and moral panic into a story that fit whatever the crown needed her to be. To the king, she was a traitor. To the romantics, a martyr. To history, a loose thread tied into the great tapestry of royal scandal and secrecy. And perhaps that's what made her truly dangerous. Not her bloodline, not her marriage, but her refusal to stay neatly boxed in. Arabella didn't want to be a pawn. She wanted to be a player, and in the end, she made her move. But if Arabella risked everything for a man who shared her bloodline, the next queen on our list risked scandal for something far more transgressive. A commoner with no royal claim at all. A man who would help her break the rules, rewrite history, and accidentally help found a dynasty. 15. Queen Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437. Queen Catherine of Valois was, by all outward appearances, the perfect medieval queen consort, demure, dignified, and draped in dynastic significance. Daughter of Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria, she was born into royal instability and married into English politics at the height of the 100 Years' War. Her union with Henry V was supposed to be the final chapter in a long and bloody feud between England and France. Instead, it became a footnote, an opening act really, for a far more intriguing tale, one in which the Queen quietly carved out her own life, her own love, and quite possibly her own scandal. Catherine's marriage to Henry V was, at best, a diplomatic punctuation mark. He invaded France, won a decisive victory at Agincourt, and then demanded a marriage that would seal his claims to the French crown. Catherine, barely 18, was given to him as part of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. By all accounts, she was lovely, gracious, and politically silent, which made her exactly the kind of queen consort medieval kings preferred. And then Henry promptly died. Less than 2 years after their marriage, Henry V succumbed to illness in 1422. Leaving Catherine, a 21-year-old widow with an infant son, Henry VI, who would be crowned King of England and France before he could say sovereignty. In theory, this should have elevated Catherine to one of the most powerful women in Europe. In reality, it rendered her a royal liability. Because the problem with young, beautiful, widowed queens, especially ones with royal wombs proven fertile, is that they become dynastic time bombs. And Catherine, already seen as a foreigner by the English nobility, was suddenly a wild card no one knew how to play. Parliament took swift, preemptive action. A statute was passed stating that no dowager queen could remarry without the king's consent. And since the king in question was an infant, this essentially meant Catherine was indefinitely barred from remarriage. The law might as well have come with a handwritten note. Stay chaste, stay quiet. Catherine had other ideas. Sometime during her extended widowhood, she began a relationship with a man who was neither noble nor royal, Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier of obscure origins who had served in her household. How exactly this liaison began is a matter of historical speculation. Some say he was her wardrobe keeper. Others suggest he was part of her personal guard. Whatever the truth, the relationship was both deeply private and profoundly public in its consequences. What we know is this: Catherine and Owen Tudor shared more than just courtly glances. They lived together discreetly, and by the time anyone in power took real notice, they had already produced several children, including Edmund Tudor, who would go on to father Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. So yes, the very existence of the Tudor monarchy, arguably the most famous in English history, can be traced back to a quiet, unofficial romance between a French queen and a Welsh commoner. Of course, once the relationship was discovered, the backlash was swift and predictable. Catherine's connection to Owen was painted not as romantic but as scandalous. She was accused of moral laxity, irresponsibility, even recklessness. The idea of a queen, forming a household with a man of no title, no land, and no formal permission from the King's Council was unthinkable. Or rather, it was thinkable. It just made for particularly delicious court gossip. And as always, the rumours snowballed. Some chroniclers accused Catherine of having taken lovers before Owen Tudor. Others claimed she was far too familiar with members of her household. A few even whispered that she had entertained visitors during her time at Windsor Castle. These may have been exaggerations, projections, or pure invention, but they speak to a deeper cultural truth. When powerful women exercised personal agency, especially in their intimate lives, society responded with slander dressed as documentation. Catherine died in 1437 at the age of 35, likely from illness. At the time, her children with Owen Tudor were quietly absorbed into the nobility, their status neither fully acknowledged nor entirely denied. Owen himself was eventually imprisoned, released, and later executed during a skirmish, his life ending as anonymously as it had begun. And yet, the legacy Catherine left behind, unofficial, unblessed, and thoroughly inconvenient, would go on to reshape English history. Her grandson, Henry VII, would seize the throne after the Wars of the Roses and retroactively sanctify her relationship with Owen Tudor by turning it into royal mythology. What began as a hidden romance became the foundation of a dynasty. Was Catherine reckless? Possibly. Was she in love? Maybe. Was she a royal woman who chose her own path in defiance of law, tradition, and polite court expectations? Absolutely. And so, while her critics painted her as impulsive, secretive, and even indecent, history shows something more radical. A queen who quietly lived outside the lines drawn for her, and in doing so, passed her defiance down through blood. But if Catherine's rebellion was veiled in romance and legacy, our next royal took her own pleasures with fewer apologies, leaving behind a string of artists, politicians, and eyebrow-raising liaisons that even her family couldn't quite explain, except to say she was a daughter of a queen and she behaved like it. 16. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, 1848 to 1939. Princess Louise was the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and from the very beginning she seemed constitutionally incapable of behaving like a Victorian princess was supposed to. While her siblings either resigned themselves to dynastic duty or quietly blended into the royal wallpaper, Louise turned in the opposite direction, toward art, politics, scandal, and the kind of romantic freedom that made her mother wince behind lace curtains. She was beautiful, clever, and blunt, three qualities that, while admired in a duchess, were considered deeply inconvenient in a daughter of the Queen. Louise didn't just think independently, she spoke independently. She criticized court traditions. She questioned marriage as a social contract. She made sarcastic comments about her mother's control over the household. In a family where emotional restraint was a kind of currency, Louise was practically in debt. She also had an artistic streak, not the usual embroidery and watercolors kind, but a serious, focused, fiercely dedicated talent. She studied sculpture at the National Art Training School and eventually became the first royal woman to publicly exhibit her work. That may sound quaint now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Royals weren't supposed to work. They were supposed to be ornamental, not artistic. And they certainly weren't supposed to go into London studios unsupervised to sculpt nude models from life. But Louise did, repeatedly. Her closeness with artists, many of them male, many of them strikingly less royal, became the stuff of salon gossip. One of her longest-standing rumoured companions was the sculptor Joseph Edgar Boehm, a man twice her age with a rakish moustache and a reputation for mentoring talented women a little more attentively than necessary. Louise spent countless hours in his studio, and his letters to her, though formally composed, had undertones that court officials found bothersome. The most persistent and juicy rumour that Boehm died in Louise's presence, or more precisely in her arms, after suffering a stroke during a private meeting. The palace predictably denied everything. Officially, he died at home, but the suddenness of his death, combined with Louise's visibly shaken state and a flurry of hushed activity at Kensington Palace that day, left plenty of room for the kind of speculation that historians politely footnote and gossip columns would have devoured. But Boehm was hardly the only man attached to her legacy. Louise's romantic life was a rotating carousel of suspicion, ranging from palace equerries to politicians to artists, and even, as some have dared to suggest, members of her own household staff. One theory that has never quite faded is that she had a child out of wedlock in her early 20s, possibly fathered by a commoner, and that the baby was quietly adopted out and erased from royal records. The evidence is circumstantial: coded diary entries, vanished servants, and a sudden disappearance from public life in 1866 that was never fully explained. But in a royal family obsessed with optics and lineage, the mere persistence of the rumour has kept historians circling it like moths around a gaslight. Eventually, Queen Victoria arranged for Louise to marry John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, heir to the Dukedom of Argyll. It was a political compromise disguised as a love match. Lorne was aristocratic but not royal, Protestant, Scottish, and unlikely to challenge the Queen's authority. Louise accepted, possibly out of affection, possibly out of exhaustion. The marriage was cordial but never passionate. Lorne was rumoured to be uninterested in women altogether, a fact not lost on the whispering classes of both London and Ottawa, where he served as Governor-General of Canada. Louise, meanwhile, continued to live as independently as her title allowed. She maintained her own residences, travelled alone, and spent long stretches apart from her husband. Her private correspondence, though carefully archived, often hints at emotional attachments that don't appear on the official family tree. She once wrote of an unnamed dearest companion, whose loss left her inconsolable and whose identity remains one of the many mysteries embedded in her otherwise tightly sealed personal life. Unlike many royals on this list, Louise lived a long life. She died in 1939, just shy of her 92nd birthday, having witnessed the reign of 6 monarchs and the collapse of the empire her mother once symbolized. By the end, most of her secrets were buried beneath layers of propriety and dust, but the outline of her rebellions never fully faded. Was she promiscuous? That depends entirely on how one defines the term in a society that punished women for curiosity, autonomy, or the simple act of enjoying their own company. Louise wasn't careless. She was careful, but she was also bold. She lived a life just outside the official margins, where rumours were currency and the truth was always dressed for dinner but rarely invited to speak. And while Princess Louise cultivated her mystery behind stone statues and studio doors, the next queen on our list let hers bleed into the political arena, a sovereign whose affections, rivalries, and secret longings shaped the very core of her rule, and whose whispers still echo behind the thrones of Europe. 17. Queen Anne of Great Britain, 1665 to 1714. Queen Anne ruled over the unification of England and Scotland, oversaw the rise of Britain's parliamentary power, and left behind a monarchy forever changed. And yet, for all her constitutional achievements, her reign remains as memorable for its emotional entanglements as for its political reforms. Behind the throne, beneath the powdered wigs and parliamentary debates, Anne's court was a theatre of whispers, rivalries, and a peculiar intensity that has puzzled historians for centuries. Her closest relationships weren't with ministers or monarchs, but with women. And what those relationships really were remains one of the most persistent, tantalizing mysteries in royal history. Born the second daughter of James II, Anne was never expected to rule. Her sister Mary was older, smarter, and married to William of Orange, an imported Protestant power couple custom-built for dynastic stability. Anne, meanwhile, suffered through a childhood marked by ill health, isolation, and endless family strife. Her mother died when she was young, her father was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, and she endured at least 17 pregnancies, with none of her children surviving to adulthood. By the time she ascended the throne in 1702, Anne had been hardened by loss, trained by trauma, and shaped into something both deeply human and eerily unknowable. She was not a flamboyant monarch. She lacked the charisma of Elizabeth I, the machinations of Catherine de' Medici, or the cool defiance of her successors. But where Anne lacked outward flamboyance, she more than made up for it in intensity, especially when it came to the people she let close. And none were closer than Sarah Churchill. Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, was Anne's childhood friend, political confidant, and as many have speculated, the object of a deep and possibly romantic affection. Their letters, preserved in exquisite and often fevered prose, drip with emotion that feels, depending on your lens, either intimately platonic or unmistakably personal. Anne signed letters to Sarah with phrases like, "I am wholly yours, and I cannot live without you." Sarah, for her part, called Anne by the pet name Mrs. Morley, while she signed her own letters as Mrs. Freeman, a playful conceit that framed their relationship as a private domestic partnership. They wrote constantly, they saw each other daily, they quarreled like lovers, they reconciled like old friends, and when their relationship soured, it unraveled with the venom of a personal betrayal, not a political one. For decades, scholars have debated whether Anne and Sarah's relationship was sexual, but to ask that question too directly is to miss the point. Whether or not they shared a bed, they certainly shared a bond that transcended court etiquette, and in an era where women's affections were expected to stay within the polite confines of sisterhood and Christian charity, Anne and Sarah's emotional intensity stood out. To some, it was endearing. To others, it was dangerous. It became politically dangerous too. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, was a military genius and a rising star in the War of the Spanish Succession. Sarah used her influence with Anne to advance his career and push Whig policies, but Anne, increasingly resentful of Sarah's domineering personality, began to drift toward a new favourite, Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin, and, as some claimed, her opposite in every way. Where Sarah was sharp and overbearing, Abigail was quiet, gentle, and deferential, or at least she appeared to be. Abigail's rise caused a full-blown court scandal. Sarah accused her of manipulating the Queen, of spying for the Tories, and, in what would become one of the most scandalous accusations of the age, of seducing Anne. Pamphlets were circulated anonymously, suggesting that Anne and Abigail shared a relationship more suited to poetry than politics. One pamphlet mockingly referred to Anne as the Sapphic Queen, making oblique references to unnatural affections and female fondnesses that cross the borders of decency. Anne, deeply private and increasingly exhausted by the constant battles, withdrew. She broke ties with Sarah in 1711, and the friendship never recovered. Abigail remained a fixture of her court until the end of Anne's life. Whether she was merely a trusted confidant or something more is left to history's soft focus lens. What's clear is that Anne's court was ruled not just by policy but by proximity. by the shifting tides of affection and resentment, of loyalty and rejection. Her reign was defined as much by who sat beside her in the shadows as by who stood before her on state occasions, and her personal entanglements, nuanced, contradictory, and frustratingly undocumented, remain among the most captivating mysteries of royal intimacy. So, was Queen Anne a nymphomaniac in the traditional lurid sense? Number. But was she a woman whose emotional and possibly romantic dependencies disrupted court politics, alarmed her contemporaries, and fueled centuries of rumor? Absolutely. And that, in its own quiet way, was just as provocative. But if Anne's desires were cloaked in letters and domestic codes, our next royal made little effort to hide hers at all. A medieval countess turned queen whose bold affairs shocked the nobility and whose name was practically synonymous with scandal in the earliest chronicles of British royalty. 18. Mary II of Scotland, Countess of Boulogne, 1082 to 1116. History has a curious habit of brushing past Mary II of Scotland, not because she lacked pedigree or political relevance, but because the kind of scandal she embodied was so early, so medieval, and so inconvenient for the chroniclers of her time that it was easier to let her reputation ferment quietly in the margins. Yet beneath the official record lies the shape of a woman who took a torch to the expectations of royal womanhood and left behind a trail of rumors, broken conventions, and power plays that made even her contemporaries mutter into their manuscripts. Born around 1082, Mary was the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret of Wessex, which meant she was born into the rare hybrid of Scottish fire and Anglo-Saxon piety. Her sister Matilda would go on to become the wife of King Henry I of England and Queen Consort. Mary, however, followed a less linear path. Her life was not marked by quiet submission or neatly arranged alliances. Hers was a record full of crossed-out names, political recalculations, and a romantic history that could best be described as ill-advised repeatedly. As a child, Mary was sent to be educated in a convent, not unusual for noble daughters of the time. But unlike many of her peers who took the veil and quietly faded into monastic footnotes, Mary broke away, quite literally. Records indicate that she left the convent without formal release, casting doubt on whether she had ever taken religious vows or whether she simply decided that a life behind cloistered walls was not for her. Either way, the departure was controversial enough to raise ecclesiastical eyebrows, and in the 11th century, that was no small feat. Her decision to walk away from a religious life might have been forgivable had she returned to the court and married in a respectable, well-negotiated arrangement. But Mary, as was becoming her trademark, had her own ideas. She eloped. Her marriage to Eustace III, Count of Boulogne, wasn't arranged through careful diplomacy, but rather unfolded through a courtship that some described as passionate and impulsive. Eustace was no obscure noble. His family was among the most powerful in northern France, but the nature of the match and the apparent lack of royal oversight raised immediate questions. Was it love? Was it strategy? Was it a moment of rebellion that spiraled into a marriage of necessity? The answers remain elusive, but the timing and secrecy suggest that Mary was not interested in waiting for permission. What followed was a series of developments that, depending on who you ask, range from mildly scandalous to outright explosive. Mary became Countess of Boulogne, and she bore a daughter, Matilda of Boulogne, who would later become Queen of England as the wife of King Stephen. But Mary's presence at court, particularly her influence over Boulogne's administration, was noted for its assertiveness. She wasn't simply decorating the throne. She was giving orders, managing estates, and exercising political power in ways that made some uncomfortable, particularly when coupled with the persistent rumors that her early religious retreat hadn't been entirely sincere. Then came the more speculative parts of the record. Contemporary chroniclers, especially those with axes to grind or sermons to write, began alluding to Mary's worldliness, a code word for moral flexibility. Some claimed she continued to engage in relationships that blurred the lines of fidelity. Others hinted that her departure from religious life was less a spiritual epiphany and more a matter of forbidden affections. There were murmurs of secret liaisons in the French countryside, of noble visitors whose stays at Boulogne stretched beyond the diplomatic calendar. None of this was ever formally proven, but that was the beauty of medieval gossip. It didn't need to be. The most damning commentary came not from any official indictment, but from the silences in the records. Letters lost, chronicles with curiously missing pages, monks writing of Mary's unfeminine boldness and her dangerous passions without ever naming names or deeds. Her story became less about documented scandal and more about a moral tone, a suggestion always hanging just off page that she was not to be trusted. Mary died in 1116, likely in her early 30s, leaving behind a daughter who would, ironically, become a paragon of royal virtue. But Mary herself faded into semi-obscurity, not quite villain, not quite heroine, but a royal ghost who slipped through the cracks of propriety and refused to explain herself. Was she truly promiscuous, or simply a woman unwilling to let her life be dictated by abbesses, bishops, and court officials with feathered pens and fragile egos? Either way, she challenged the order, and the order responded the way it always did, with erasure and euphemism. But if Mary's rebellion was dressed in veils and marriage certificates, our next queen would make hers in royal silk, a woman who married 2 kings, outlived them both, and left behind a trail of power plays and accusations that suggest she didn't just rule beside thrones. She may have collected lovers like trophies behind them. 19. Queen Emma of Normandy, circa 985 to 1052. If you've ever wondered what it looks like to survive the collapse of one dynasty, marry into another, and emerge not only intact, but quietly powerful, Queen Emma of Normandy is your answer. A queen twice over, first to Ethelred the Unready, and then to Cnut the Great, Emma's life wasn't just shaped by the tides of English politics, she was the tide. Her story is one of strategic marriages, royal entanglements, disputed succession, and of course, the kind of rumors that only follow women who live too long and know too much. She was born around 985 into the ducal house of Normandy, daughter of Richard I, sister to Richard II, and great-aunt to William the Conqueror. Emma was not just well-bred, she was genetically engineered for political leverage. In 1002, she was married off to King Ethelred of England, a man whose epithet, the Unready, wasn't just a nickname, but a full-blown indictment of his reign. Ethelred was paranoid, indecisive, and under siege by the Danes. Into this mess walked Emma, a Norman bride sent to stabilize a throne built on very wobbly foundations. Emma and Ethelred had several children, including Edward the Confessor. But their marriage, like most royal unions of the era, wasn't remembered for warmth. It was transactional, strategic. She was the exotic foreign queen. He was the embattled king with a crumbling kingdom. When he died in 1016, England didn't just change rulers, it changed hands. Enter Cnut the Great, a Danish prince, conqueror, and, according to most accounts, exactly the kind of Viking warlord your average Saxon noble feared and secretly admired. Cnut defeated Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, in battle, took control of England, and then did something few expected. He married Ethelred's widow. This is where Emma's story takes a sharp, politically fascinating turn. Instead of returning to Normandy or entering a nunnery, as many widowed queens were expected to, Emma aligned herself with the new regime, not just to survive, but to thrive. She married Canute in 1017 and became Queen of England once again. She was now consort to the man who had conquered her first husband's kingdom, and she didn't just tolerate it, she helped consolidate his rule. Together, Emma and Canute had a son, Harthacnut, setting up a complicated succession dynamic. Because now, Emma had two sets of royal children, one Anglo-Saxon, the other Danish. And with that split came suspicions, manoeuvring, and yes, a healthy dose of rumour. Some contemporaries accused Emma of favouritism, suggesting she prioritised her children with Canute and sidelined Edward and Alfred, her sons from Ethelred. Others went further, implying she encouraged the exile of her older sons to secure the throne for Harthacnut. Whether this was maternal strategy or survival instinct is anyone's guess, but the court didn't hesitate to paint her as overly ambitious and emotionally selective. And then came the accusations of intimacy that extended beyond politics. Emma was one of the most powerful women in Western Europe during her lifetime. She negotiated with kings, funded churches, and oversaw the production of her own propagandistic biography, the Encomium Emmae Reginae, an unprecedented move for a queen. But that kind of visibility came at a cost. In later years, rumours emerged that she had maintained questionable relationships with powerful men at court, both during her widowhood and while her second husband was away ruling over his northern empire. One particular name stands out, Bishop Stigand, an ambitious and politically savvy churchman. Some sources hinted that Emma was overly familiar with him. Though no contemporary court record explicitly accused her of impropriety, the innuendo was there, tucked between the lines of chronicles, waiting to be decoded by curious monks and later equally curious historians. She was also accused, long after her death, of keeping too close a circle of favourites, men whose promotions at court seemed suspiciously rapid. As usual, the implication was that her influence was won not through diplomacy or intelligence, but through charm, seduction, or some other ill-defined female art. That she could have simply been smarter than the men around her was somehow unthinkable. When Canute died in 1035, the succession crisis she had helped create came to a boil. England fractured between her son Harthacnut and Canute's illegitimate son, Harold Harefoot. Emma initially tried to rule as regent, but she was ousted, exiled, and eventually returned only after Harold's death. Her son Edward the Confessor would finally take the throne, awkwardly installing his mother again at court, where she lived out her final years, watching the political world shift and shudder just as it had always done around her. She died in 1052, a queen who had navigated 3 reigns, 2 husbands, 2 dynasties, and a continent of contradictions. Was Emma truly promiscuous? It's doubtful, but she was powerful, visible and unapologetically political, which in medieval England was more or less the same thing. The chronicles couldn't quite define her, so they turned to insinuation. She must have seduced, she must have manipulated, she must have done something because no woman could wield that much influence without crossing a line. But Emma's legacy isn't in the rumours. It's in the dynasty she helped build, the wars she survived, and the quiet, calculated ways she played the long game and won. And yet, if Emma's power was cloaked in strategy and wrapped in royal robes, the queen who followed her in history's parade of scandal wore her reputation more boldly, framed in satire, whispered about in corridors, and drawn into courtly caricatures that blurred the line between politics and passion. 20. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, 1683 to 1737. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was no one's pawn. In an age when queens were expected to smile softly, breed often, and politely fade behind their husbands, Caroline did something audacious. She participated. She didn't just endure court life, she infiltrated it, shaped it, and occasionally ran it from behind the curtain. But with that power came a predictable reaction, and like so many politically savvy royal women before her, she was rewarded not only with admiration, but with a long growing list of accusations, whispered affairs, satirical poems, and the ever-reliable charge that she was too involved with the wrong sorts of men. She was born Wilhelmina Charlotte Caroline of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a mouthful of titles from a relatively minor German duchy. Orphaned young, she was raised by a politically aware stepmother and received an education that would later unsettle the English court. Fluent in several languages, well-read in Enlightenment philosophy, and fully capable of debating with bishops and lords, Caroline was not bred for decoration. She was bred, quite accidentally, for domination. When she married George Augustus, the future George II of Great Britain, it was seen as a decent political match. He was temperamental and stiff. She was clever and composed. Together they formed a power couple that ruled not through affection, though they had it in their way, but through efficiency. Caroline quickly became not just consort, but conciliere. She advised George on everything from state appointments to church disputes, often behind closed doors, sometimes quite plainly in public. He trusted her. He listened to her. And for many in Parliament, that was the problem. You see, powerful queens have always attracted a peculiar form of criticism, the kind that doesn't come from what they do so much as from what people think they must be doing behind closed doors. And so the rumours began. The Queen's influence, unnatural. Her relationships, too close. Her court, filled with favourites. Her interest in theology, clearly a cover for something more salacious. And just like that, Caroline's court became not just a political hub, but a breeding ground for insinuation. Satirical pamphlets of the time portrayed her as scheming, carnal, and hypocritical. Some claimed she had an inappropriate fondness for the court physician, Dr. John Freind. Others raised eyebrows at her close ties with certain ministers, particularly Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister. Was it politics or something more? Walpole himself dismissed the gossip with a smile, saying, "She is too wise a woman to ever lose her head for politics or passion." But the insinuations lingered. Even her spiritual advisor, Samuel Clarke, a respected clergyman and philosopher, wasn't spared. Their correspondence, deeply intellectual, theologically rich, was read by some with a raised brow. A queen who all corresponded with a man on matters of metaphysics and morality was already unusual. But a queen who clearly enjoyed the correspondence, who sought it out, who challenged his ideas, that was another matter altogether. The idea that Caroline's intellectual curiosity could coexist with personal loyalty was apparently too radical for many to grasp. So instead, they imagined something else: secret affections, hidden alliances, emotional dependencies that veered suspiciously close to the forbidden. No proof, just pamphlets, gossip, and a steady drip of courtly snickering. Caroline's relationship with her husband didn't help her case. While George II remained publicly devoted, he was also openly adulterous, especially with his long-term mistress, Henrietta Howard, who served as one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting. Rather than banish the mistress, Caroline welcomed her into the household. Critics saw this as weakness. Friends understood it for what it was: control. By embracing her husband's affair, Caroline kept her enemies closer. She prevented a younger, more ambitious rival from taking Henrietta's place, and she ensured that the real centre of power remained exactly where she wanted it, with herself. It was a masterstroke of emotional judo, and the court could barely stand it. And still the rumours persisted. Because for many in 18th century England, a queen who was both sexually controlled and intellectually powerful presented a contradiction too complex to tolerate. She had to be either saint or seductress. There was no category for competent. Caroline died in 1737 after a long illness, during which she continued to advise the king on state matters from her deathbed. Her final words to George, after enduring excruciating pain in silence, were reportedly, "Do not grieve too much for me, dear George. I am your true wife." He was so devastated he reportedly never took another mistress, which in itself might have been the most unexpected ending of all. So was Queen Caroline of Ansbach guilty of any great indiscretions? If you mean scandalous affairs, probably not. But if you mean power, independence, and intimate friendships with powerful men, absolutely. She was guilty of knowing too much, doing too much, and being too visible for comfort. And in the royal court, that's always been enough to get you labelled. But if Caroline outmaneuvered her enemies with intellect and irony, our next royal took a more unrestrained route. A woman whose tangled web of lovers and secret marriages turned the English court into a tabloid centuries before tabloids were invented. 21. Joan of Kent, 1328 to 1385. Joan of Kent was beautiful, high-born, and, by every surviving account, a magnet for romantic catastrophe. She didn't merely scandalize the English court, she bewildered it, tangled it up in legal confusion, and forced the royal establishment to confront a nightmare it had never anticipated, a noble woman with the audacity to follow her heart and outmaneuver the system. She was called the Fair Maid of Kent, but her story was anything but fair or maidenly. It was a series of ill-timed marriages, disputed vows, and enough contradictory paperwork to send canon lawyers reaching for the wine. Born in 1328, Joan was the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, the youngest son of Edward I. This made her a Plantagenet, a royal cousin, and from the beginning a woman whose bloodline made her valuable and vulnerable. Her father was executed for treason when she was just a toddler, and though the stain of rebellion lingered over her family, Joan grew up at court, known for her beauty, charm, and unusually stubborn will. She could have played it safe, married quietly, done her duty. But Joan didn't do quiet. At around the age of 12 or 13, depending on which source you believe, she secretly married a knight named Thomas Holland. A minor noble, Holland had none of the status or approval required for such a match, but he had something else: Joan's affection. Their union, conducted in secret and without royal consent, might have remained a romantic footnote had Joan not been immediately scooped up by her family and married off again, this time to William Montague, heir to the Earl of Salisbury and very much not Thomas Holland. This is where things get complicated. According to Joan, her marriage to Montague was invalid because she was already married. According to Montague's powerful family, her prior marriage to Holland was either a child's fantasy or a fabrication. Meanwhile, Holland had gone off to war, giving everyone involved just enough time and distance to dig themselves deeper into a legal and moral quagmire. When Holland returned from the Crusades, he petitioned the Pope directly to recognize his marriage to Joan. After years of ecclesiastical back and forth, Rome ruled in Holland's favor. Joan's second marriage was annulled. She was declared Holland's lawful wife, and the court, already reeling from the implications, began murmuring something dangerous. Did she do all of this on purpose? After all, Joan had managed to escape a politically forced marriage, reclaim her chosen partner, and win the backing of the church. That kind of legal precision wasn't typical of impulsive teenage brides. It was strategic. And if Joan had been a man, they would have called it brilliant. Once officially reunited with Holland, Joan settled into something resembling normalcy for a time. They had several children together and appeared genuinely devoted. But fate, as always, had other plans. Holland died in 1360, leaving Joan a wealthy widow in her early 30s, with experience in both court politics and marital chaos, which naturally made her even more desirable. Enter Edward the Black Prince. The eldest son of King Edward III and heir to the throne, the Black Prince was everything a medieval hero was supposed to be. Chivalrous, charismatic, and war-hardened. He had already fought in France, won accolades on the battlefield, and become a national icon. When he chose Joan as his bride, the court nearly imploded. A twice-married woman, tangled in scandal, whose reputation was anything but virginal. Not exactly the storybook match, but they married anyway, this time with full royal approval. Joan became Princess of Wales and eventually mother to the future Richard II, from scandal to dynastic mother all in one generation. It would have been a clean redemption arc had Joan not continued to attract gossip even in her later years. Chroniclers accused her of wielding too much influence over Richard, of meddling in court politics, and of favouring certain lords with suspicious generosity. Her closeness to particular men in her household was noted, not with evidence, but with tone. The kind of tone that medieval scribes reserved for women who smiled too often or advised their sons too confidently. Even after her death in 1385, Joan's life remained difficult to categorize. Was she reckless or romantic, calculated or impulsive, a victim of a patriarchal system or its most agile player, possibly all of the above? The truth is that Joan of Kent's greatest scandal wasn't her secret marriage or her annulled second union or even her rise to royalty. It was her refusal to play her role quietly. She made decisions, she demanded legitimacy, and she survived, not in the shadows, but in plain view. And if Joan's path to power was carved with charm and legal technicality, the next royal on our list would find herself in a different kind of spotlight, one lit by paparazzi flashbulbs, broadcast to millions, and fueled by a love life that blurred the line between tabloid spectacle and tragic revelation. 22. Princess Diana, Princess of Wales, 1961 to 1997. Princess Diana wasn't just a royal, she was the royal, a woman who, through a whirlwind of charm, tragedy, and relentless tabloid pursuit, became one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century and the most dissected. Her image was everywhere, eyes cast downward beneath feathered bangs, radiant in gowns at gala events, weeping silently in hospital visits. And always, just behind the lens, a storm of speculation. Who was she seeing? What did she know? Who really left whom? Diana's reputation for romantic excess didn't emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated, sometimes by the press, sometimes by palace insiders, and sometimes candidly by Diana herself. In an institution known for its stiff upper lip and tighter control of personal narrative, she did something unheard of. She told the truth, or at least her truth. And once the dam broke, the flood was unstoppable. She was born Diana Spencer in 1961 into an aristocratic family with close ties to the royal circle. Her upbringing was affluent but emotionally unsettled, marked by her parents' bitter divorce, boarding school isolation, and an early craving for affection that would become a defining theme in her later life. When Prince Charles, over a decade her senior and already under pressure to marry, began courting Diana in 1980, she was 19, shy, and by all accounts, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. Their engagement was formal, awkward, and vaguely doomed. When asked if they were in love, Charles famously responded, "Whatever in love means." It was, in hindsight, less a warning sign and more a full-on fire alarm. But the wedding went forward in 1981, watched by over 750 million people worldwide. Diana stepped out of that carriage at St. Paul's Cathedral like a vision from another century. The fairy tale began, except it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a slow, well-dressed breakdown. Almost from the start, the marriage was haunted. Diana was young, sensitive, and increasingly aware that she was not her husband's first love. That honor, of course, belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman who never truly left the frame. Diana knew, everyone knew, and yet, for years, the palace maintained the fiction. So Diana did what anyone might do when trapped in an unwinnable game. She started writing her own rules. She threw herself into royal duties, appearing at hospitals, shaking hands with AIDS patients, walking through landmines. But behind the smiles, she began cultivating a private world, one filled with her own confidants, phone calls, and eventually lovers. James Hewitt was one of the first names to burst into public view. A dashing cavalry officer, he and Diana reportedly began their affair in the mid-1980s, while her marriage was visibly unraveling. Their relationship lasted several years and became one of the worst-kept secrets in Britain. Diana later confirmed it in interviews, describing it with a mixture of regret and candor. The tabloids, of course, had a field day. Hewitt's red hair and proximity to Diana's younger son sparked ridiculous, unfounded conspiracy theories that still circulate, though they've been thoroughly debunked. But Hewitt wasn't alone. There was also Barry Monarchy, her bodyguard, whose presence in her life was abruptly terminated by reassignment, and soon after, a motorcycle accident that Diana described with visible discomfort in private tapes. There were also businessmen, artists and political aides, Oliver Hoare, Hasnat Khan, James Gilby. The list became a constellation of names, many of them confirmed by Diana herself, and all of them orbiting a single unspoken truth. Diana was trying to feel loved, fully, on her own terms. It wasn't just the number of men, it was the emotional texture of the connections that fascinated people. These weren't strategic dalliances or arranged courtships. They were human, often messy, sometimes clandestine, and always heavily scrutinized. Diana didn't conceal her pain. She spoke about it openly, first in private recordings with biographer Andrew Morton, and later in the explosive 1995 BBC Panorama interview, where she famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The world watched in collective discomfort as the royal image cracked. Diana was no longer the demure bride. She was the wounded, self-possessed, politically savvy woman reclaiming her story. And her romantic life became not a weakness, but a form of protest. A declaration that if the crown could not protect her, she would find affection wherever she could, regardless of how it looked in the morning papers. But the public's appetite for Diana's story was insatiable, and by the time she began a relationship with Dodi Fayed in 1997, it was clear that her every movement was being consumed, interpreted, twisted. Her death, sudden and brutal, didn't end the story. It froze it, locked it in amber, and preserved her not just as a princess, but as a myth. So was Diana a nympho, as her tabloid enemies sometimes sneered? Hardly. She was a woman hemorrhaging from 1,000 emotional cuts, looking for connection in a palace built on detachment. Her romantic life was messy, yes, but also courageous, desperate, and fully human. And while Diana lived out her tragedy on the global stage, the next queen in our list played a quieter game, a medieval consort whose polished image belied a court life filled with mysterious favourites, ambiguous affections, and just enough plausible deniability to keep the truth forever out of reach. 23. Queen Philippa of Hainault, 1310 to 1369. Queen Philippa of Hainault is usually remembered as the good queen, the gentle queen, the loyal wife of Edward III, whose virtue and humility were immortalized in stained glass and schoolbook paragraphs. She famously begged for the lives of the burghers of Calais, won the hearts of the English people, and gave birth to 13 children, including the notorious Black Prince. In an age of brutal monarchs and court intrigue, Philippa is often treated like the exception, warm, kind, and above reproach, which is exactly what makes the rumours about her all the more interesting. You see, beneath the immaculate image crafted by royal chroniclers, those faithful servants of legacy, there's a quieter, more complicated story. Because even queens with excellent reputations are not immune to suspicion, especially when they're foreign, powerful, and surrounded by a court full of ambitious men. Philippa was born into the house of Avesnes, a noble family from what is now modern-day Belgium. She was intelligent, well-educated, and politically aware, traits not always encouraged in medieval women, let alone future queens. When she married Edward III in 1328, she was still a teenager, but already carried herself with the grace and precision of someone who understood the value of appearances. Their marriage, at first glance, was stable. In comparison to the bitter, destructive unions of some of her royal peers, Philippa and Edward III seemed genuinely affectionate. He respected her counsel, trusted her judgment, and gave her broad influence over court matters. She travelled with him on military campaigns, acted as regent in his absence, and administered large swaths of land in her own right. And yet, whispers began to circulate. Not during the height of her reign, but in the quieter margins of the court, among servants, clerks, and disgruntled nobles who noticed patterns, a growing reliance on certain courtiers, unusual favours granted to minor knights, private meetings behind drawn curtains that occurred too often to be ignored. The term favourites began appearing in correspondence, always with a vague, knowing tone, never an accusation, but never innocent either. One name that surfaces more than once is Sir Walter Morney, a close companion of Edward III and one of the Queen's most trusted military advisers. Morney was loyal, brave, and successful in battle. He was also frequently at Philippa's side, sometimes even in Edward's absence. The depth of their relationship remains unknown, but it was enough to provoke court gossip. He received titles, land, and special recognition for services to both the king and the queen. Benefits, some believed, exceeded the bounds of simple gratitude. Then there was Jean Froissart, the court poet and chronicler, who spent years recording Philippa's legacy in glowing, even reverent terms. His devotion to her reputation bordered on poetic obsession. While Froissart was hardly a political player, his access to Philippa's court and his adoration of her person fed a narrative that she was not just admired, but worshipped. That level of intimacy between queen and chronicler raised questions about how much of her history was fact and how much was carefully curated fiction. What complicates the story further is the environment of Philippa's court itself. It was unusually cosmopolitan for the time, filled with musicians, artists, poets, and foreign advisors. She brought with her a retinue of attendants from Hainault, many of whom remained in her service for years, enjoying generous stipends and surprising upward mobility. Their loyalty to her was unquestioned, so was their discretion, with affection as a political tool, the way kings so often did. We may never know, but the persistence of the questions speaks volumes. Queens who are remembered for goodness are often those who learned how to hide their agency behind a smile. And if Philippa's virtue was polished for posterity, the queen who follows her wore hers like armour, regal, foreign, and perpetually accused of turning royal loyalty into a dangerous whispered indulgence. 24. Queen Henrietta Maria, 1609 to 1669. Queen Henrietta Maria of France arrived in England as a Catholic bride in a Protestant country, already branded with suspicion before she spoke a single word of English. Married to Charles I in 1625, she was 17, foreign and devoutly Catholic. 3 qualities guaranteed to make half of Parliament flinch. But it wasn't just her religion that unnerved England. It was the persistent belief that Henrietta wasn't merely a queen consort, she was an operator. A woman with too many men at her side, too much influence over her husband, and far too little interest in playing by the rules. From the beginning, Henrietta Maria was never going to be subtle. She arrived with her own entourage of French courtiers, priests, and attendants, and refused to participate in Protestant religious services, an act that didn't just raise eyebrows, but triggered full-scale political tantrums. She clashed with Charles's closest advisors, demanded the removal of English ladies-in-waiting, and surrounded herself with her trusted countrymen, several of whom were young, male, and suspiciously ever-present. The English court, already edgy about having a French queen with a personal chapel, began to notice patterns. Gentlemen from her native France stayed longer than etiquette required. Artists and musicians employed at her command were given access to private royal apartments. The Queen's circle, so tight and foreign-speaking, quickly became a favourite subject of speculation in anti-Catholic pamphlets. Henrietta wasn't just viewed as a queen, She was painted as a manipulative seductress, guiding state matters through her charm and whispered conversations. One name frequently associated with her inner circle was Henry Jermyn, later Earl of St. Albans, a suave courtier who rose rapidly in favour and was known for his close, almost inseparable companionship with the Queen. Jermyn managed her affairs at court, handled her finances, and accompanied her even into exile during the Civil War. Rumours about the nature of their relationship flourished. It didn't help that Jermyn remained unmarried and had a reputation for discretion that seemed suspiciously well practiced. Contemporaries whispered that Jermyn was more than a court favourite, that he may have been the Queen's confidant in every sense. Some even speculated that her youngest children may have borne more resemblance to her chamberlain than to her king. These were whispers, of course, the kind that history books often politely ignore, but they were loud enough in their time to circulate through London's pamphlets and reach even the fringes of Parliament. Henrietta's political influence only added fuel to the fire. She was involved in secret negotiations, lobbied foreign monarchs for support during the English Civil War, and even raised money and troops in Europe. Her letters to Charles were deeply affectionate, even intimate, and filled with advice, instructions, and reminders of her loyalty. Some historians have viewed her as a devoted wife. Others have seen her as the true architect of the monarchy's resistance, the power behind the increasingly unstable king. After the royalist collapse, Henrietta fled to France, taking refuge in a convent, though retirement was hardly the word for it. She remained politically active, hosting a court in exile and continuing to press for royalist support. Jermyn remained nearby. Their association never ceased, nor did the whispers that theirs was more than political. She returned to England briefly during the Restoration, but never again held real influence. Still, the shadow of her reputation lingered. Henrietta Maria's image was never rehabilitated in full, not because of her politics alone, but because she embodied something even more threatening to the 17th century English imagination, a queen with secrets, power, and the wrong kind of intimacy with the wrong kind of men. And if Henrietta Maria was scandalized as a foreign queen with too much access and not enough humility, the royal woman who followed her would carry the same name as a future legend and leave behind a legacy every bit as colourful, chaotic, and salacious in the candlelit salons of Georgian society. 25. Lady Diana Spencer, 1734 to 1808. Before the world had the Diana, it had a Diana, Lady Diana Spencer of the 18th century, a woman whose name echoed down gossip-laced hallways long before it appeared in headlines and paparazzi photos. This Diana wasn't married to a Prince of Wales, didn't wear sapphire rings or deliver speeches about landmines, but she had all the ingredients that would make her spiritual descendant so infamous: beauty, aristocracy, poor timing, and a scandalous knack for choosing all the wrong men. Born in 1734 into the powerful Spencer family, Lady Diana was a granddaughter of the 3rd Earl of Sunderland, and thus already embedded within the elite core of British aristocracy. She was connected to wealth, rank, and influence, but she quickly became known not just for her lineage, but for her habits, specifically her habits of the heart. While her early years showed every sign of a promising debutante, it wasn't long before her name began circulating with an urgency that made even the more jaded members of Georgian high society take note. Her romantic life was a revolving door, and more notably, an open door. Courtiers, politicians, military officers, and poets alike seemed to rotate in and out of her confidence. There was no single scandal that defined Lady Diana's reputation. Instead, it was the pattern, the sheer volume of flirtations, flings, and fiery breakups that earned her the nickname the Merry Spencer among her peers. Merry, in this case, was polite code for undeniably entertaining and possibly morally dangerous. Unlike some royal women who concealed their affairs under veils of discretion, Diana appeared to revel in the attention. She hosted salons that blurred the line between political debate and thinly disguised flirtation. Her letters, many of which survive, are witty, biting, and filled with suggestive innuendo. She had no qualms about being seen in the company of men whose reputations matched her own in volatility. If anything, she seemed to gravitate toward them. One of her most infamous associations was with a prominent Whig politician whose career was as erratic as his private life. Their liaison was so public and so divisive that it triggered a minor scandal within Parliament, with debates not only about policy, but about whether his relationship with Lady Diana was affecting his votes. It almost certainly was. Another lover, a noted military officer, was rumoured to have gone into a duel over her honour, or perhaps just her attention, though no official record of the duel remains. What does remain are memoirs from contemporaries who describe Diana as dazzlingly social, alarmingly free with her affections, and wholly unconcerned with convention. She never married, or rather, she never stayed married. Depending on the source, she either rejected every proposal or made certain her relationships burned out before vows could be finalized. This, more than anything, turned her into an object of fascination and discomfort, a noble woman with means, mobility, and no husband. In the 18th century, that was barely distinguishable from sedition. As she aged, Lady Diana didn't fade so much as glow dimmer by choice. She retreated from public life, hosted quieter gatherings, and remained a fixture in letters and memoirs of the time. Her name became shorthand for both allure and danger, a walking contradiction, liberated and judged, admired and mocked. Today, she's largely forgotten, a footnote to the Spencer family, eclipsed by her 20th century namesake. But in her time, she embodied a different kind of royal scandal. One that didn't come from affairs of state, but from the simple, defiant act of not caring what the court thought, and for that she was unforgettable. And thus we end the catalogue of Britain's most uncontrollable royal women. Queens, princesses and noble consorts who lived outside the lines, laughed too loudly, loved too freely, and refused to be footnotes in anyone else's story. Their names echo not because they were perfect, but because they were dangerous, in heels, in armour, or in ink.